On the night of the 9th of October 1935, a horse-drawn sulky with 2 people aboard was approaching Fitzgerald's Bridge, about a mile and a half outside of Forbes, New South Wales. Here, Luigi Orilga and Ethel Wells could cross the Lachlan River on their way to their home on the Condobolin Road, a few hundred yards away. Ethel had attended a school sports day at Parkes and spent some time with her grandchildren. Luigi had gone in the sulky to fetch her from the Forbes railway station. He was said to have been in a happy mood when he left the farm on the errand. At 8 p.m. it was dark, but the moon was out and there were bright lights at either end of the bridge. There were small farms nearby, and on the southern bank of the river the Sullivan family were even outside on their veranda and saw the rattly old sulky crossing the bridge. But nobody saw the murderer. They only heard 5 shots ring out. Ethel call out, "Who is it?" then scream, and saw the flash of gunfire, and only Jim Sullivan saw Luigi Orilga stand up in the sulky and fall over onto the bridge, before he turned and followed his wife, who had quickly ushered their children inside the house. Orilga was a market gardener who lived in a hut in the middle of his garden, about 100 yards from the bridge. The land was leased from Mrs. Wells, who lived in a weatherboard cottage 100 yards on the far side of Orilga's farm. Orilga was 41 and had lived in the Forbes area for about 10 years. He was a native of Stilo in the Reggio Calabria province of Italy, where his wife and son lived. He was said to have a temper, once shooting at grasshoppers which had gotten into his tomato field. Ethel Wells, born Ethel Malzard about 1875, was 60 or 61 and had been married 4 times. She was still referred to as Ethel Ryan by some in the area, her name before marrying James S. Wells in 1934. Her final marriage lasted only 1 week before her husband left the house and never returned. James Wells was found living in Sydney at the time of the murder and was quickly cleared of suspicion. Frederick Smithers, who was employed by Orilga, heard 4 shots and saw the flash of at least one of them. Although he was quickly on the scene, he did not see anyone but the victims on the bridge when he arrived. Smithers, Bert Pymont, son of a local farmer who rode over to the bridge, and another young cyclist named Henry Leist were the first to reach the sulky. The horse was not fussed by the gunfire and was eating grass by the side of the road. The men found Ethel Wells slumped down from her seat, one arm and her head resting against the seat, her face black with gunpowder and splashed with blood from a bullet hole in her temple. This bullet had exited through her jaw. A second bullet had gone through her chest, while a third hit her hip and deflected up into her heart. Her skirt was smouldering where the bullet had ended. Whoever had killed the pair had been close enough to push the gun against the victims' bodies when they fired. Orilga had been hit twice with bullets from a .32 rifle, once in the head and once in the back. His body lay 60 yards away from the sulky in the middle of the bridge, surrounded by a pool of blood. Again, like Ethel Wells, Luigi had been shot at close range, the rifle against his back, the blast shattering his spine. The bullet that passed through his chest broke in 2 as it passed through his lungs. Death was near instantaneous for both. Basil Clifton was driving a truck loaded up with picnickers who heard the shots. He passed over the bridge a few minutes before the shooting, noticing Wells and Orilga heading for the bridge, and reported seeing a car driving fast towards Forbes, which sped past him just after the shots were heard. The car was located, but was found to be someone who had been in a hurry to make it to the cinema on time. The murder weapon was possibly thrown into the river, but the turbid Lachlan was 30 feet deep under the bridge, and locating and retrieving it, if it was there, would be difficult. The search for the rifle spanned a number of days, with 12 relief workers in boats on the river dragging the muddy water, and others waiting up to chin high in the water along the banks either side of the bridge. Relief workers was the term applied to the unemployed of the Great Depression in Australia, who were paid the dole by the government for working temporary jobs like this. The gun was never found. Orilga was buried in the Catholic section of Forbes Cemetery on the 10th of October. 12 members of the local Italian community attended their compatriot's funeral. With the killer having managed to slip away unseen and the weapon eluding the police, on the 22nd of October a reward of £200 was offered for information. Attention began to focus on a local farmer, a farmer who had a history of antagonism with both Luigi Orilga and Ethel Wells. His name was William Robert Bathgate. He was 37 years old, the son of Alexander and Catherine Bathgate, pioneers of the Forbes district. Trouble had begun between Bathgate and Wells 5 years earlier, when some of Bathgate's cows strayed onto her property and ruined some fruit. Then his horse wandered in, and Ethel intended to impound the equine. A fight broke out between Bathgate and Orilga. Bathgate tried to sue Orilga for assault over the matter. Once Ethel had used a stick to hit Bathgate. Orilga then claimed somebody had tried to sabotage his pumping plant, prompting him to stand guard at night with a gun when he saw somebody lurking about there. Oddly, at the inquest in late October, Smithers claimed that Orilga did not have a gun, to his knowledge. When a fire broke out at Bathgate's farm on the 4th of March 1935, which destroyed his house, Orilga was charged with arson, but acquitted, with Ethel Wells providing evidence on Orilga's behalf. Ethel's son, Clarence Phillips, lived in Forbes, and on the day of the shooting Ethel had visited her daughter-in-law Ivy. She told her that Bathgate had been over to her farm and thrown her little dog into boiling fat, badly scalding the animal. Orilga had to shear the dog after its ordeal. On the day of the shooting, Bathgate claimed he was in Forbes until 7 p.m. Then he returned home and was in his shed when he heard the shots. Leopold Villete, a market gardener who leased some land from Bathgate, was having tea with his wife and 4 daughters in their home about 400 yards from the bridge when they heard the ambush. Leopold noticed that Bathgate's house was in darkness at the time. He ventured out to the bridge to find out what had happened, and passing Bathgate's found it still dark and quiet. Margaret, his 15-year-old daughter, however, said she saw Mrs. Iris Bathgate pull down the blind in the kitchen as the shots rang out. Soon after, she saw the woman running and calling, "Rob, Rob, where are you?" Margaret asked if she had heard the shots, but Mrs. Bathgate said no, and kept running to where she said her husband was with a mare. She declined Margaret's offer of accompanying her. At 10 p.m, Leopold saw Bathgate and went over to ask what he thought about the incident. Bathgate strangely replied, "I know nothing about it. I want to have nothing to do with it." When questioned later that night by police, when told who was dead, he is alleged to have responded, "That's a bloody good job. I could tell you a lot, but I'll say nothing." Police kept a vigil on Bathgate's house, noticing lights coming on and going off several times during the early hours of the morning. At the inquest in Orange on the 31st of October, a labourer named Walter Coatsworth stated that Bathgate had come to his camp a week before and asked him if he had made a statement to police. When Coatsworth said that he had not, he alleged Bathgate replied, "If you had made one, it won't be much good as you won't be there." Coatsworth had in fact given a statement, but said Bathgate had a violent temper and lying to him about it was the safer option. Another labourer named Andrew Leonard, who was camped near the river, saw a man running along the reserve soon after the shots, who claimed he was looking for a horse. Bathgate admitted to police that he was there looking for a horse. When asked if he had washed his hands, Bathgate shot back, "Did Leonard tell you that?" Bathgate said he washed his hands because the rope he was using with the horse had made them dirty. He knew the water was fouled there by a sewage outlet, but washed his hands in it anyway, he said. Called to give evidence, Bathgate admitted he was not on friendly terms with either of the deceased. He had had a gelding poisoned, which he blamed Orilga for, as well as the fire at his house. However, he denied that the last time he saw them was when Ethel ordered him off her property, with the threat that Orilga would shoot him if he wasn't quick enough. On the 7th of October, somebody had poured acid into the fuel tank of his tractor, but he denied he had taken the law into his own hands. He denied telling Smithers he'd pay him £10 to say Orilga had put the acid in the tank, and denied that when lodging a complaint about the matter, saying that it would be the last complaint he would lay against Orilga. He also denied ever saying that if he met Orilga on the bridge, he would shoot him cold. Locally, that wasn't believed, as he admitted his children came home from school, where the other children had said that their father was the killer. On the 3rd of November, an auction sale of Mrs. Wells' property took place. During the sale, a girl discovered £15 10 shillings hidden in a cobwebbed old tin hidden behind a sideboard, which was handed to police. As Mrs. Wells was rumoured to be wealthy, a search ensued for more concealed treasure, but nothing further was uncovered. The old horse which had been pulling the sulky was sold for £2. Since the murder, nobody had been able to make the horse pass the spot where it occurred. On the 4th of November, the coroner remarked that Bathgate had lied to police. However, though warned that he did not have to, he had also given evidence under oath. The coroner handed down an open finding. Orilga and Wells were murdered by person or persons unknown. The years rolled by. The coroner passed away and the case remained unsolved. On the 9th of August 1945, nearly 10 years later, William Robert Bathgate, now aged 47, was charged with murder. Bail was denied. At a hearing, Walter Coatsworth, now 63, claimed he had been afraid of both Bathgate and the coroner. He claimed that Bathgate had asked him if he knew any underworld figures, saying he would pay them £20 and their fare to pot Mrs. Wells. Then he offered Coatsworth £30, as well as a promise of a house and employment to murder the woman, and finished by saying he'd get her out if he had to do it himself. Coatsworth added that the morning after the shooting, Bathgate had confessed his guilt to him. Bathgate was committed for trial, but only for the murder of Luigi Orilga, not Ethel Wells. The trial took place in March 1946, with Bathgate pleading not guilty. He said Coatsworth had tried to blackmail him in return for favourable evidence. Bathgate was described as tall, bronzed and crisply spoken. The Crown prosecutor put it to Bathgate that he had been fined £10 for cattle stealing 15 years ago. Bathgate emphatically denied it. It was a bad start by the prosecutor, who had to admit in court that he was mistaken, and that Bathgate had not been convicted of cattle stealing at all. He had been a witness in a case in 1923, and he had been fined in 1928 for not clearing burrs from his paddock. It was later learned that this false rumour had been supplied by a Detective Sergeant Dimmock, who had links to Forbes. Bathgate's lawyer used it to full advantage to paint the police as overzealous in trying to affix guilt to his client. It was a strange trial, and another bombshell hit as it was nearing its conclusion. A witness was called at the last minute, a widow named Mrs. Emily Thomas. She said that she had been near the bridge the night of the murder and had heard the shots. Soon after, she encountered a man on a bicycle named Hennaby with a rifle slung across his back. He said he had been duck shooting. Then in 1938, Hennaby had ridden up to her house in Forbes, carrying a rifle and speaking excitedly. He asked for her son. When she told him he was at Morris's, the man told her to keep her son away from Morris's place, or he would shoot him, the same way he had shot old Mother Ryan, a name used for Ethel Wells. On the 29th of December 1938, following an argument with 72-year-old Mrs. Louisa Morris, 63-year-old Robert Hennaby shot her through the head. He then clubbed her daughter, 36-year-old May, over the head with a gun, injuring her severely enough to warrant hospitalisation. When arrested for murder, he told the officer, "I have taken strychnine," before he collapsed soon after. Despite treatment, Hennaby died in agony 20 minutes later. The argument had been that Hennaby had been too familiar with Mrs. Morris's 14-year-old granddaughter. Despite the sensational development, the jury found Bathgate guilty, and he was sentenced to death on the 20th of March, 1946. Holding that serious irregularities might have resulted in a miscarriage of justice, the Court of Criminal Appeal set that judgment aside and granted Bathgate a new trial on the 3rd of May, 1946. The second trial was a swift affair at the end of May. The jury asked if they could bring in a verdict without hearing final addresses by the lawyers or summing up by the judge. Told that they could only do so if they brought in a unanimous verdict of not guilty, they did just that. Immediately Bathgate was acquitted. He was charged with the murder of Ethel Wells. 2 weeks later it was announced the Crown would not proceed with the second charge. Bathgate walked a free man. William Robert Bathgate sold his property in 1948. He died suddenly while being operated on for bowel trouble on the 2nd of December 1948, aged 50. The murders on the bridge remain officially unsolved.